J. Barber. My name is Gusi Carpenter. I was born in England. My mother was German and my father was English. So I had this interesting growing up time where I was part of the enemy in England. And I did used to wonder where I belonged because I spoke German fluently and I spent a lot of time in Germany when I was growing up. Erich used to talk about congenital felicity and how that's really important in your connection with God. So my maternal grandfather was a Lutheran minister in Germany. And just a little aside, they were very anti-Hitler, and they would go, "Heil Hitler," like that. My mother came to England quite a bit after the war because she couldn't get a passport approved for a while. And we lived about 30 miles from London in the country, so we had a lot of green belt around us, and it was quite, it wasn't that big a place. Great Bursted it was called, outside Billericay. And I had a lot to do with our local Anglican church when I was growing up. And in fact, most of the people I knew were Anglicans. I had a great aunt who was a Catholic, and that was a great curiosity to the family. And then I had school friends who went to the Catholic school next door to us, and there was all this. So it wasn't what you'd call a very diverse community. There's certainly no people of colour. In fact, I think an Indian man came around selling shoelaces door to door, and my aunt, who's only 10 years younger than me, when she opened the door and saw him, she screamed. So that's how few people of colour there were around. So it was a very Anglo-WASP sort of place. But we had a great vicar, and I was in the choir, and he did a lot of youth activities, and I used to go to church. And in fact, in my teens, I'd go 3 times a day. I'd go to, 8 o'clock communion, and then something else in the evening thing. And I think even my family thought I was a bit over the top. But I remember sitting in church and thinking, I bet Jesus has come back again, because we didn't recognise him last time. And I remember having that thought in my teens, and then I would go thinking, they're not telling me something, and it took me years to work out that they actually didn't know what it was either. And in fact, I think the best explanation I ever got about the parables was from Don Stevens, and that was in London. He gave a wonderful talk about the parables, and he connected it with the speak that we learnt from Barber, so it was very interesting. So I went through high school, and I kind of cruised through. I didn't work very hard, I have to say. I can remember, Ella's been studying like mad for her exams, and it's not even year 12, and I used to sit by the swimming pool and I'd have a G.K. Chesterton book underneath my schoolwork. And anyway, I had a pretty easy time. Do all I can really remember was the water to wine thing, and where he equated it to the divine love. He explained that the wine is divine love, and I'd never really considered that before. And and I really left the church behind when I was 16. And I mean, there would be people in England that remember what Don said, and because there were a few people at that meeting. It was I'm sure it was the old Eccleston Square days. Yeah, but if you ask some of the English group that were connected to him, and someone like Craig Sandrock would probably know as well. Anyway, so when I finished high school, I went and worked in Germany and then in France for a year, and then I went and studied to be a teacher in Winchester. And all of a sudden I was confronted with the fact about where was I going to spend my adult life. Everything had kind of been laid out. You go to school, you go to college. Now the big decisions come, and I used to get the map of England out, and I'd open it up and stare at it, waiting for inspiration, and none came. And I'd shut my eyes and put my finger down and go, no, I'm not going there. And I wrote to the army to see if I could get a place teaching in the Berlin, in a school in Berlin with the army school, and they wrote me this very nice letter back apologising that they only took people who had at least 1 year's experience. I mean, I had family in Berlin and I'd been there, and it was a very cool place, you know, very interesting. So so that was an option that was wiped out, and I had this. Oh yes, there was one place, Reading, that was a good education area, and I actually wrote and got the application papers, and you know, that's the day of quink ink, and I was filling it out and I spilt my bottle of ink all over it, and you know, I was very fatalistic then. It was like, it was a sign. So and then I just was in a total quandary, and I just didn't know what to do. And I had some friends who were migrating to Tasmania, and they said to me one day, well, we haven't liked to ask you before, but why don't you come with us? And instantly I thought, I'm going. And I said to them, I'll think about it. Now this is just before Easter 1970, so Barbara dropped the body a year before. And I was going back to visit my parents for Easter. My sister was there, and she and her family were about to migrate to Canada. And I went to Tasmania House on the way through London, and I fixed it all up. So I arrived at my parents' house, and here they are confronting, you know, the elder daughter who's got a new baby and a husband, and she's going to go to Canada. And I say, well, I'm going to Tasmania, and it was really a bit much for them, you know, it was very difficult. But that's what happened. I didn't leave until, I think it was November or December of 1970, I flew to Tasmania. I had no idea anything about Tasmania. My mother had a German friend that she knew through the Lutheran group, and so that was a contact. And this friend, I stayed with his parents. But it was I tell you, Tasmania in 1970 was not like London in 1970, that's for sure. You know, when I'd gone from Winchester to watch people like Frank Zappa in London, it was a bit of a different scene. But I still hadn't heard anything about any spiritual thing. So you know, I just feel like Barbara led me by the nose, and I was completely blindfolded. And I'd been in Tasmania for 3 months, and I was living in a group house that was a bit wild. You know, there was a recording studio downstairs, and there was a party at Easter, and I met this man called Ian Beecroft, and the next day I said to one of the guys who lived in the house, who's Mayor Barbara? And I truly cannot remember where I first heard Barbara's name. And they said to me, oh, you need to ask Croft about that. And so I had conversations with him, and I felt quite connected to him, and he lent me God Speaks, and I remember taking God Speaks in my hand and feeling, this is really important. But I still feel, looking back, I just feel like I was completely veiled. I mean, I didn't have 7 veils, I probably had 77 veils, you know, but it just felt, I just had no idea. It was all kind of happening without my really knowing. And so that's 1970, and 1970 I stayed, I must have stayed in Tasmania, and the following summer, and I was teaching by then, and you know, every time I had summer holidays in England, like from the time I was 12, I would go to Europe. So, you know, you don't spend your summer holidays where you live, you go somewhere else. And so I still didn't you know, I remember having The Everything and the Nothing, and I think that was a very important book for me. And I had The God Man that I read. But I'm gobsmacked that later on, I don't really know what I read. I mean, it's almost like I read it with my eyes shut or something, you know. So it came to the time where I thought, I have to go to India. And this is 1972. And I knew a woman who thought she might like to come with me. I had a friend that I'd met at college she was teaching in Udaipur. So I thought, oh well, I can fly to Delhi and I can go to Udaipur and then I can go and check out the Meher Baba thing. Now the thing about Croft is that he didn't tell me anything about anybody in Australia. He had heard about Baba from Mike and Janine Kinnear, who went to the Great Darshan. And all he said to me was, you have to go to Pune. Well, you know, I just accepted that. I said, I have to go to Pune. And I never thought about what I'd do when I got there. So my friends in Udaipur that I went to stay with, well, Yabo, she had an American boyfriend, and they actually now live in Tasmania, which is kind of nice. They said to me, oh, you know, when you go to Bombay, stay at the Salvation Army hostel. It's full of lots of young people. It's really cool, you know, lots of drugs. And anyway, that was, you know, a big part of the scene at the time, wasn't it? So I land there, and they were lots of really nice people. And, you know, a lot of them said, oh, well, you know, we're heading off to Goa. Why don't you come with us? And I say, no, I've got to go to Pune. And one of the guys staying there was English, and he was like a freelance journalist, or I don't know if he fancied himself as a freelance journalist, but he said to me, well, there's a typewriter. I mean, this sounds ridiculous today. There's a typewriter in Pune that I can use. And imagine now thinking you've got to find a typewriter anywhere, you know, just put it all on your phone. So he was dithering, and I had, oh, sorry, I must go back. The woman who was going to come with me to India, I haven't even told you about arriving at Delhi, I bought my ticket thinking she'd buy hers, and then she says, oh, well, I've got a new boyfriend and I've got a dog, and so she didn't come, which actually was, I went, gulp, well, I'm still going. And it was actually really good that she didn't come with me, because I don't know how it would have gone. And I have to tell you that when I arrived, you know, we flew there, we had a night in Singapore, and then we arrive at Delhi at like 2 in the morning. And I get off the plane, and there are 2 guys with blankets over their shoulders and rifles, and I go, oh my God. So I go into the airport, you know, and go through everything, and I sit down. I think, I'm not going out. I've got nowhere to stay. I don't know what I'm doing. And they're saying, you've got to leave, you've got to leave. And I just sat there. And when I left in the morning, you know, I just bumped into 2 people who said, oh, come with us, and they took me to a hotel. Do you remember the impact of people living on the street? I mean, I remember that so strongly, that there were people sort of on the side of the road doing their washing, their, you know, cooking, everything, and it was like, whoa, this is different. And I thought everybody had TB. I didn't know about betel nut, you know, and they're all spitting, I think they're all spitting blood on the road. Anyway, so it was kind of interesting, and it was really scary, you know. I was quite frightened for a long time, which, anyway, so, and I did a train ride to Udaipur, and then Udaipur to Bombay, and then this guy came with me from Bombay to Pune. And I didn't have to do anything. I just had to go to Pune, and he organised the Tonga and took us to a hotel. Now, I think a couple of years ago, I worked out that the hotel is right next to Shivaji Market in the camp near Baba's family's house. And we walk in, and this woman who looked a bit Chinese, she walked straight up to me, she ignored him, and she said, have you come for Meher Baba? And I went, oh, yes. She said, his brother lives very close by. She was incredibly bossy. His brother lives very close by. She wrote down the number. Go and ring him up next door. They've got a telephone next door. And so I obediently went and rang him up. And he came round to see me. And you see, this is the thing I find so weird. When I met him, he embraced me and I burst into tears. Now, why did I do that? I didn't know who Maya Barber was. But I also had this thought, see, I must have taken something in. It doesn't matter that I didn't meet Barbara in the body. So it's so weird what your brain does, isn't it? And he gave me a picture. He had all these photographs, and the next day he showed me these photographs, and they're all of when Barbara was in Bangalore during the Blue Bus tours, and I've called them the Tata Matting series because Barbara's sitting in front of Tata Matting. Anyway, he said I could choose one, and I did. And you know, I think back now, I never gave him any money for it. I didn't pay for the rickshaw. He took me around all these places. You know, we saw the elephant that Barbara used to feed the bananas to, and you know, we just went to all the sites that you would have gone to in '69 when he took everybody around as well. And then he put me on a bus, and he said, now when you get off the bus in Ahmednagar, you get a Tonga and you go to King's Road. So, you know, I'm on the bus, people spitting blood, beetle juice out at the window next to your arm, you know, exciting things like that. And we get there, and I get in a Tonga, and I say I want to go to King's Road, so to RDK Irani's office. And there are all these kids running along behind me going, Jai Baba, Jai Baba, Jai Baba. And I'm going, this is really weird. And I walk into the trust office. And this is where, you know, here I am. I never really knew where I belonged between England and Germany. I moved to Tasmania, and I'd been there a couple of years. And I walk in, and Money says, welcome home. And it was just so profound. You know, it's so funny. Why is a home so important? And in fact, I mean, I've had lots of homes, but that has never stopped being my home. And I remember saying to Katie, why was it so hard to leave? And she said, well, it's the home of your heart. They were so quick, the Mandalay, they always had a good answer. So anyway, Money was there, and, you know, big hug, Jai Baba, welcome home. And then she asked this guy, Stu, who was very good friends with Peter and Sonia, and I think he and his wife had been in Japan with them. And so she said to him, take her over to the Daulat. I mean, she took one look at me, and I went to the Daulat, not to Viluz, which was perfect. Viluz was probably a bit too posh for me at that time. And I was given a room with Sheila Krinsky. Well, Sheila Krinsky and I are still such good friends, and we laughed so much we both almost fell out of bed that first night. It was just incredible. And you know, one of the things that the people in Bombay had said about Barber people, they'd say, oh yeah, we've met a few of those. They're a bit weird. And the next morning when, you know, we all used to have breakfast outside, and there was an American young man there, and he had his picture of Barbara and about 20 vitamins around his plate, and I thought, oh, those people were definitely right. People are a bit weird here, but everyone was going to Merazad that day, and so what do? You just tag along and you go to Merazad, and, you know, on the ST bus. And we walk into Merazad, and and the other thing was that Money said to me, oh, the Australians are coming. Well, of course, I didn't know what she was talking about. And I heard it over and over again. It was like, the Australians are coming, the Australians are coming. Are you going? Yes, I don't know who they are. And so I think they assumed because I was from Tasmania I would know, but I didn't have a clue. So there's Francis sitting on the veranda next to Erich. And I used to smoke drum tobacco, and he was smoking drum tobacco, so I felt like I was at home. But I can't remember a huge amount about that day, but I felt very welcome. And Bao was there as well, and I mean, they were all there. And at some point in the day, I was taken to Mira and Money's bedroom with 4 other people, and I was standing by the window while Mira was talking about Baba, and she started talking about the tree, and she explained how after Baba dropped his body that lichen grew and bits of bark fell off and Baba's face emerged in the tree. And she said, you see there are 5 holes in his forehead. She said they symbolise Christ's suffering for humanity. And I started to weep. I didn't have a handkerchief, like now, I can't find my hanky. And, you know, it's sort of embarrassing, isn't it? You're in a place where you don't know people and there's snot running down your face, thank you. And it just took me a while to really compose myself so I could turn around. Because, you know, I thought I'd left Christianity behind, and I really do think I had. But there was something in her saying that. There was like this terrible pain, you know. Anyway, when I finally turned around, everybody else was crying too. She was standing by the door crying. And that was my visit there. And then at the end of the day, I mean, we used to stay there all day. You know, we'd be lucky if we left by 5. And I remember I was walking along the Merazad approach road, and Francis was on one side of me and Bao was on the other. And it was like, it's like the blindfold came off. It was like, oh, of course, Baba's God. And it was so natural and amazing, just amazing. So then I had this incredible time where I just was drowning in love, you know, and there were all these wonderful people and lots of great singing, and it was just the most incredible time. And I extended my stay so that I could stay for Amatithi. And 1973 was a terrible drought year, so we only had a 1-day Amatithi. And I don't remember much about it, except I know Kathy Haas and I got in the back of a truck to go back to Ahmednagar. So then I had to leave and come back to Australia. And I stopped in Melbourne with a friend, and I just thought I'd be able to tell people about Barbara and they'd automatically become Barbara lovers. What a joke. And my experience in Melbourne meant that when I got back to Tasmania, I didn't tell anybody what had happened, and they all kept saying, but what's happened? You're different. And one of my close friends, he came up with me to the anniversary in 73, and he really thought that he'd walk into Barbara's room and have an experience like I did. And it was quite difficult. He said a couple of things that he walked in and all he could think about was picking his nose and something else I won't mention. But, you know, it's just interesting. And he now lives in this area and he became a Christian, but it just wasn't for him, you know. And then I had to cope with living without any other Barber people around me in Tasmania, and that was really difficult. But fortunately, Julie Pearson and Alma moved down and they got in touch with me, so I did have some Barber contact. But I couldn't wait to get back to India, and I took 3 months off teaching, and I was back there just at I think I might have left on like Christmas Eve of 73 and spent 3 months right through till the end of the season. At the end of that 3 months that I spent in India, I was going to go to England afterwards and see my family, and give them the good news. I'd actually already given them the news in a letter, and then I started to wonder what they're thinking. So in that 3 months, it's interesting staying for a long time. And there was another guy, Mike Ernst, you probably don't know him, but you might know his brother Carl. And we just used to hang out together all the time. And I remember we'd cycle, we'd leave, we must have left at something like, it was still dark. Would it have been 4:30? If we were going to cycle to Marybud from town, would we have left at 5:30? We probably would, wouldn't we? So there was a canteen, the Saroche canteen, and we get our super duper roll the night before, which was a hard-boiled egg with tomato and onion in it. And then we'd cycle off, and I know the dogs would be chasing us, trying to snap at our heels, and we'd cycle out to Morning Arty, most days that we didn't go to Merazade. And we'd stay, we'd just hang out there the whole day, and Mansari would give us little snacks, not a lot, but we'd sometimes have something with her, not always. And those were such precious times, I mean, you'd remember Mansari, 3 o'clock, she'd come out. Mansari was tiny. She always wore a white sari. She'd put her saris under her bed so they'd be flat and not creased. And she lived incredibly simply. And she was very short, but very powerful. And every afternoon at 3 o'clock she'd come out, time for tea. And it was like party central. Anyone who was there would go in, and we'd all hang out together, and she'd tell stories, and it was just wonderful. I just talk a bit about going to England after I'd been there, and I took my mother, the 1925 photo of Barbara, and she put it on the sideboard, and my German grandmother was there. Now, she'd been married to the Lutheran pastor, and she saw this picture and she goes, "That's the devil!" So I thought, well, she'll be a Barbara lover next life. To have such a strong reaction. And I took my mother with me, and she wasn't a Barbara lover, obviously, but I took her with me to go to a meeting at Eccleston Square. Well, we were the only people there, and the guy who was running the meeting, which is often what happens. And she'd done a lot of Bible study. She was involved with the Lutheran Church, and she said to me afterwards that she felt it was like what it would have been like for the early Christians, which I thought was interesting. And she, of course, later became a Barbara lover herself, and people would say, "How long have you been a Barbara lover?" And she'd say, "All my life." I've developed this theory that when you go to the tomb, look out, because I feel like our sanskaras are like those jars of coloured sand, and when you go there, Barbara tips them all out and rearranges them. So, you're likely to have some major changes in your life. And I gave up teaching. I just couldn't stand teaching anymore. Suddenly it was like finished for me. And so then I had to do something else. And I sort of fell into the social work course, which is where I met David. So I did want to talk about the Mandali, because when I met Francis, he said to me that first visit, "You're so lucky, And I think us all coming was such an affirmation for the Mandali that Barbara really was God, because he'd said we'd come. And it was such a bizarre event for all these young people to rock up. I mean, where did we all come from? But he said they were all still so attached to his physical presence, and they found it so difficult. And he felt that we actually were free of that attachment to his physical body, and it was much easier for us. In the early days, people would say, "Oh, if only I could have just seen him once," or "If only I could have just, bowed down to him, even just touched his toe once," And I know I used to feel like that too, but nobody talks about that. I don't hear people talk about that anymore. My experience is that people who find out about Barbara now, they have a much more direct relationship with him. But for me, the Mandali were like, they were like second best. And I don't mean second best as in inferior. And obviously, you know, Baba said, my Mandali are not me, and they weren't. But they were such a wonderful introduction. And they gave us so much love, and they gave us so much information, and they demonstrated such a way of being that was the most unusual. And you know, I'd go to sort of training sessions when I was a social worker, and they'd want you to write about someone who's inspired you, and I never knew what to say, because the only people who inspired me really, like, there isn't, you know, I mean, I think the Dalai Lama is pretty inspiring, but the Mandali were like, how can you write about them to someone who doesn't really get it? So anyway, I just think the Mandali have been incredibly important, and I just think about, you know, particularly at Mehrza, the hugs and the kisses and the love that we got, it was just astonishing. So there are other things that Francis, you know, Francis had such an understanding that Baba is the highest of the high, and he would say things to us, you know, and I see people do it now. They've got flowers and they're lining up to go into the tomb, and they're smelling the fragrance. Well, Francis saw us doing that, and he said, well, don't do that, save the fragrance for the Lord. And you know, it's all about, this isn't for you, it's for him. And then my nephew was quite sick, and I said to him, should I pray for him? And he said, why would you not assume that Baba knows exactly what's going on? You don't need to pray for anybody. That's like being rude to Baba, you know? And also later, well, no, maybe, I'm not sure when, anyway, but he did say to me that a life of selfless motherhood, sorry guys, is worth 10 lifetimes of a yogi meditating on a mountain, because the yogi can have their mind in the gutter. And I guess the implication is, if you're a mother, you've probably got your head in the nappies and not there. And I really did find him quite inspirational, and he was like this little chimpanzee. I mean, it sounds terribly denigrating, but I don't mean it like that. He was just, I really thought he was a wonderful man. And he did write to me about living in Tasmania and say, I couldn't expect to find other Baba people there, really. And we did find one or two, and then, of course, my Baba was my family was my Baba, were my Baba contacts after that. But anyway, I want to move on to Mansari, and there are just some things, I just remember so much about her. She was so little but so vibrant. There was, I'll tell you one incident. The first year I was there, this guy, Ken Rexted, we all used to stand up the side of the tomb when we did arty, and some of you probably remember that now, you can't even go in. Anyway, he fainted and he fell on the marble. Not only did he fall on the marble, but there was blood. And we're all going, oh, Ken, are you all right? Are you all right? Mansari just pushed us out of the way and started cleaning up the blood. And you see, those sorts of things tell you what's important, don't they? That's like, you know, devotion to the Lord in action. So I remember her telling me when she was 11 years old, she was very attached to Upasni Maharaj, and she wanted to be with him. And he said to her, this is not your time with me is not now, you must go to Baba. And she had, because she'd had this connection with him, she had a lot of stories that sometimes sound a bit weird, but it's the stories that Upasni told about Rama and Sita and the connection with Queen Victoria, and you know, this whole kind of history of the Indians thought that the monkeys that went and helped rescue Sita had red bottoms, and so the Indians always used to wonder if the British, they thought the British were the monkeys, and they wanted to know if we had red bottoms. And I do remember that when I was first in Udaipur, my friend said that they often called us red monkeys, and they thought it was because we go red in the sun, but I wonder if it wasn't something else. She had absolutely no tolerance from people who separated from their partners, and when I stopped using David's name, because I didn't like it, I went back to Carpenter, and she thought I'd separated from him, and she just cut me dead when I walked in. And then I explained to her what had happened, and then everything was all right again. But, you know, that same day she did that to me, somebody else came in who'd been very close to her, an American, and he and his wife had separated, and he worked so hard to get her attention, she just wouldn't have anything to do with him. So they had very, you know, I do think, like, it's not all about being spiritual people, it is about their social context and how they see the world. You know, there was a lot of talk amongst the Mundley about that. The other thing was her connection with snakes. And you won't have heard this, but she once woke up and there was a cobra asleep on her chest. Now, she was small, so her shoes were about that long, and they were like a, well, what were they? Well, they were sort of like a slipper without a back, little leather brown shoes. And she managed to flick it off onto the floor and get one of her slippers and whack it and kill it. And after that, for 10, I think it was 10 nights, she'd hear its mate clicking as it went round. And she said, "Barbara, it's the snake or me." And it stopped. But, you know, I would often go to see her and she'd say, "The devil's been here today." She said, "See those hinges down the side of the door? They were black when I walked in." And she'd had a crate. Now, the crates are terribly poisonous. So she, I don't know, look, in the early days, there were so many snakes on the hill at Mehrabad, and they used to always ring a bell if they saw one, because if you didn't see where it went, it would just go down a hole and be gone. But lots of cobras. And of course, she taught us how to, she'd clean the tomb every day, and she taught us how to clean the tomb properly. And it was such a daily ritual. And I remember in about 2000, so funny, I was cleaning the floor in our toilet in Dornoch Terrace, and I thought, tomb cleaning is finished for me now. I just never cleaned the tomb again. I don't know, it wasn't really that they were the same, something about being on your hands and knees maybe, I don't know. But I just didn't feel like I needed to do it anymore. And, you know, I remember Paul Morris and I, we would be on either side. One time we were on either side of the marble, and you'd get half of it, you know, you could do half. And so we were just sort of going and meeting hands in the middle. I mean, it was always such an incredible blessing to be able to do that. So Mansari was not allowed to leave the hill except to go to the dentist and to take her dogs to the vet. And in 1985, she had her last tooth taken out. And this friend of mine said to her, "You won't be able to bite us anymore." And she went, "I've still got my tongue." And I saw her once, these two really, I don't know how to describe them. They were Westerners, but they were so dodgy, and they looked like they were on lots of drugs. And she just got rid of them like that. Just, they were gone. So, and the other thing I also remember about her is that when she couldn't stand up for Artie anymore, you know, when she got older and frailer, she wouldn't go to the tomb. She'd do Artie in her room. She felt it was so disrespectful to not stand for the prayers. I don't have much to say about Padre. You know, I mean, I know there are all these stories about him being fierce, and I know that he was, but when you met him, I didn't feel, I mean, I knew when he told me if I took food and put it on my plate, I had to eat it. I knew that that was the rule, and there were other rules, and you just had to stick to them. But I just felt he was this wonderful. He had a real gentleness about him as well, and I'm really glad I met him. Artie Senior, who was at the trust office, oh my God, he was so incredible. Like the talks that he gave, I just found them so accessible. And, you know, he did a whole series where he did God Speaks. I could never read God Speaks because I always fell asleep because it's so repetitive and meditative, and I would never get past page 6. I felt a real failure. I'll tell you now that Mara asked me if I'd read God Speaks, and I said no, and she said, what's the problem? It's in your language, isn't it? There you go. So there's a lot of talk about reading it 7 times. Margaret Krask said to me that Barbara said to her, read it 7 times, then you can read as many crime novels as you like. But I know David was terribly shocked when we got to India in '76, and Artie said, have you brought me any cigarettes or alcohol? David didn't expect a spiritual man to be talking about that. And I went to Goa one time, and he said, what are you going to Goa for? He said, you've got the shoreless ocean here, and you want to go to the ocean? It's ridiculous. He gave lots of talks that were really interesting, and it was about, you know, your sanskaras are like, they're like, if you take the stopper out of the ink bottle, that's, oh God, I can't even remember how it goes. But anyway, Barber's the protection, so Barber's the plug in the ink bottle, that was what it was. Or your sanskaras are like mosquitoes flying around you, but Barber's the mosquito net around you. And he'd talk about the importance of the tomb. And Barbara would be very insistent when they were travelling that if he dropped his body, if they could bring his body back, they should put it in the crypt. But if they couldn't, they should cremate him and bring his ashes back. And he said, you've got no idea what significance the tomb is. It's so significant. He said, people say to me, oh, but I feel Barbara more in my garden. And I'm sure people think they do, but you see, you don't really know what's happening when you go in, do you? Mara. You know, I just didn't really connect with Mara until I'd had children. And then I went in 78, and then I had Margaret in 79, and then I didn't go again until 87. And I booked a ticket. It was going to be Margaret's first trip, and I booked a ticket for Margaret and me, and I found out the next day I was pregnant. So this is baby number 4, and I was absolutely devastated. And I get there, and they started teasing me. And they told me I was expecting twins. This is Mara leading the charge on this. So, but you know, it just completely changed my relationship with her, and I just really, it was just a totally different experience. But she'd say, you know, she'd say all these things like, if you touch Barbara's chair with your foot, you should bow down to it. If you drop the picture of Barbara on the floor, you should put it to your forehead, or you should kiss it. I found this postcard. She didn't like us sending postcards through the mail because they'd be dropped on the floor. But you know, there's things like this lovely postcard, and we used to like sending them to people, but she was quite against it. Yeah, she wouldn't like you to sit with your feet facing Barbara's chair, anything like that. So, you know, just being with her, being able to go and have tea with her. In the early days, we were able to go every day. And, you know, there'd be quite a small group around the table. And they'd make tea, like ordinary tea, and then they'd make a tea with lemongrass and mint. And there'd be some little snacky things that you had as well. But the best was just being able to speak with her and listen to her, and you know, often she would shut her eyes and she'd be in another place, and at the end of afternoon tea there was a picture of Barbara at the end of the room, and she'd go and stand and she'd talk to it, and Barbara was really alive for her there. And Money, when I met Money, in her office, she tried to make me feel better about Tasmania, and she had her head, she said, look, Tasmania is right behind my head when I sit here. She called me Gusi, Gusi Gander, and then she also used to go on about the Tasmanian apples as well. One of the things that was really nice was when I was going to go to Tasmania, my cousin's husband in Germany said to me, are they very black there? I think he must have thought I was going to Tanzania. But the Mandali, they knew lots about Australia because it was part of the Commonwealth and they were educated that way. I've never heard anybody tell jokes like her. Actually, Wendy's not bad, is she? Buzz and Wendy. But she was just really great. And in the early days, she just had this wonderful kind of lightness. And as time went on, and the responsibilities of the trust and the difficulties of things that were happening in different places, you could see it was really weighing on her. And in 1974, I was in the birthday play. And you know, I still felt quite new and raw and didn't know much. Anyway, they put Anne Conlon's glasses on me and put me in some white outfit, all wrapped round. And I was Shireen Mai, and I was mummy to the baby Barbara. And Money she just cacked herself. She laughed all the way through. She laughed so much she couldn't stop. And at the end, she gave me one of her mother's handkerchiefs, which was very sweet. So we ended up, what happened with our trips to India was after we'd had children was that we would go separately so one could stay at home and look after the kids, and then children would progressively come with us. And in Money's last Christmas we were there, and it was the first time that all of us had gone together. Oh, it was so difficult, you know. Money had got a shunt in and she had a scarf, and people were asked not to touch her head, but I don't know if people didn't hear, but I don't know how she stood it. It must have been incredibly difficult. It was very sad. And I know in one of Meru's letters she said how fortunate we were to come and have that last time with Money, because she died, of course, the next year. And I do often feel, I wish I could remember so much more of what actually happened, but I do feel that it was a time of osmosis, and just being with them was what we needed. And I remember Meredith Klein saying to me that she'd talked to Money about how they needed to start looking after some of Barbara's things and, you know, putting them away. And Money said, this is not the time. And I feel that the time for us was just the joy of being with those wonderful people. And so I shouldn't worry really about not remembering everything. Rano was I really liked Rano. I think lots of us did, you know, and she'd show us her artwork. But because I was from Australia, she told me other things, and she talked about Francis. And I know she typed his manuscripts, or, you know, his poems, and there was a whole lot of poems she typed. And she said she would just sit and weep, and the paper would get so wet. And I wonder how it didn't tear, actually. The last time I saw her, she'd been unwell, she'd had an infection, and so I thought, well, I won't go and see her. And at the end of the day, I went to say goodbye because I knew I was leaving the next day and I wouldn't see her again. And she said, I've been waiting for you. I felt terrible. And I had a dream about her that night, actually, about her dying. It's funny, isn't it? I don't know why some of them affect you more than others. I guess it's just the connections. Now, because we lived in Tasmania, there were some compensations. It's just that she hugged me and died in my arms, and she didn't weigh of anything. So that's significant to me in itself. She was no weight on me. So I knew she was going to die. I did used to wish there were more Barber people around us in Tasmania, but because we lived in such a different, unusual place, we had first John and Dolly come and visit, and then Meru came with Pat. And oh my God, it was absolutely exhausting because Pat and I would sit up yak, yak, yak all night, and then we'd have to get up early to get breakfast for Meru, but it was the most wonderful time. And Lizzie must have been 5. And I moved her into another room, so Meru had her room, and Meru used to laugh with me afterwards. Do you remember how Lizzie came up and she said, "When are you leaving?" The mortification of being a parent. And you know, we went round to all these places. Meru loved hardware stores and looking at what fruit and vegetables were for sale, and we took her on a boat cruise, and she just, you know, people said, "My God, did you see, she just walked up on that boat that was moored there," but she didn't think it was anything weird. And we didn't have any formal meeting because there weren't really many people to have a meeting with, so we just were able to really enjoy her. There were a couple of other people. There was a guy called Neville who was pretty weird and, you know, really addled my drugs, and another guy, Mark, who'd been connected with Neville, who was not in a good way. But apart from that, it was really just us, and I think Ian Cox was probably there at that time, but I'm not sure. And the other thing so because Meru had been to stay, you know, sometimes there were perks in that I had this closer relationship with her, and one day, and I think it was in the 80s, and I was staying at the Pilgrim Centre, I was there by myself. She said, "Come to the kitchen." So we crept out the back, and she gave me these 2 small mangoes, and she said they were from the tree that grew from the pip that Barbara had sucked. So now, but the instructions with them was I wasn't to tell anybody that I'd got them, and that I had to eat them, and I wasn't to share them with anybody. So I followed the instructions, got quite a strong allergic reaction to the mangoes. I thought it was absolutely hilarious. So, you know, you get a treat, but blowback. You know, she very much didn't like to be in the limelight. And as time went on, I said to her, "You know, you're going to be the last one left." And no, don't say that. And I was talking to Sheila Krinsky the other day, and she said, "Oh, do you remember how we'd go out to Merazard and we'd tell jokes so that Meru didn't have to speak?" And I did notice that she'd just sit there by the door on a low-down chair, and a lot of people would come and just walk straight past because they had no idea who she was. And I remember the last visit I had there while she was still alive. It was really cold, and I'd come out just in, you know, thin clothes, and she went and got me a shawl. She was just really sweet. She was very practical and liked working in the garden, liked making metal things, liked making solar ovens. Very clever like that, and interested in lots of things. And in fact, I said to her, I'd really like to go to Jumkhead and see what they're doing. And in fact, a whole group of us went to Jumkhead, which was a rural health project. And they had, you know, they had lots of domes, which is why Pat Sumner lives in a dome, because Irene came too and came back enthusiastic. And they'd done lots of things where they were using cow manure for fertilisers, and they trained rural health workers. So it's quite an amazing thing. Mayor One came as well, and several other people, so that was quite good. I think one of the things about Go Hair that I will never forget, and I'll probably never experience again, is these incredibly soft hands. I understand that the book that's coming about her is quite painful, because it was very difficult for her not being able to help Barbara with his illnesses that were so weird. And she did say to me, I know because I found it in some of my notes that I found at home, she did say, why did Barbara give us so much pain? So they had a lot of physical pain, the Mandalay at the end. she checked me out. There were a couple of times when I was a bit worried about something that was going on with me, and just so soft and so gentle. She was just absolutely gorgeous. I didn't have much to do with Khorshid except the first visit, but she used to teach us all the Bujave Arti. Now, Katie was someone else who came to stay with us, and oh God, she was so funny. She thought she'd come and stay for weeks, I think. And I said, oh, can you just make it a week? And she, I think she was quite insulted. But I don't know how we would have managed. I mean, you know, we were both working part-time and it would have been terribly difficult. So she came with Elaine Newell, and we had such a great time together for a week. And she wrote to me from Avatar's Abode, and she said, "Dear Barbara, J. Barbara, dear Gusi, oh, it was such fun to be with you and the family. I really enjoyed my stay with you. I thank you and dear David for your most generous hospitality and for all your love and care. May beloved Barbara bless you both and your dear children. It was wonderful to cook with you, and I laughed the way Alan and I took over your kitchen and driving you crazy, but we loved it." Anyway, so that was so nice. She was really, this was a super treat. And again, you know, it created this link with us, and I used to make special kind of flowery Katie outfits to wear to Meherazad and have pearls and things and dress up like her, and I was so sad the last time I saw her. But, you know, it was what she said to me. She just kept saying, thank you, thank you. And I didn't really know what she was thanking me for, but I appreciated it anyway. In the meantime, sort of going back to the 70s, David and I went from India to England because I was going to see my family, obviously, but RDK Irani was at Oceanic, so I went to visit him there, even though I'd only just seen him. And I was offered a job at Oceanic, working for the publishing company. And in the time that I was there, I later also worked in other parts of Oceanic, and David and I, we were caretaking for a little while too, which was a bit exciting when the river decided to rise one day and all the sunken recording studio started going underwater. But that was my first contact with the photographs of the 30s. They had a whole collection from, I think they were mostly Delia's, and maybe Quentin's. I think Quentin had a camera. So I started working with photographs there. And I had something, I can't remember what it was. I know I used to send out the newsletter that they had from the association, but I don't think I had anything to do with putting it together. And of course we met Delia at that time, and Delia was an interesting character. You know, we all used to laugh and say that Barbara had made the saying, "Don't worry, be happy," just for her, because she worried about everything. She'd check on everything. And Delia was interesting because, you know, she was quite rude to people of colour and quite rude to people from a different social status that was not quite hers. But you'd go to her meetings and the sense of Barbara's presence was just really strong. And it told me that, you know, people don't have to be perfect. They just have to be what they are. And it's true what Barbara said. He uses people's weaknesses and turns them into strengths. So we got married at Oceanic. You know, David was working at Richmond Park and I was working there, and Pete sang the Pavadigar for us. Delia read the Sanctification for Married Life, so maybe that's why we've lasted as long as we have. Working with the photographs, it just made me feel this real connection with Margaret Crask. And in 1978 we went to America, and our first stop was staying with Ginny Katz in New York, and there was incredible snow at that time. It was freezing cold, and I somehow managed to get an appointment with Margaret, and David and Ginny went skating, ice skating at Central Park. And when I went to see her, I didn't understand that this was something unusual. She was at home alone. She lived in a hotel. And I walk in, she said, well, you know, nobody sees me on my own. I nearly always have somebody with me, and I'd be at work, but the taxis aren't running. And I had this amazing time with her. And when she talked to me about, she actually talked a lot about ivy juice, which hadn't been a very happy relationship. Talked about her a lot, actually, but also talked about Barbara. And, you know, that's when she told me what Barbara said, that she should read God Speaks 7 times, and then she could just read the crime stories, because that's what I like to. And I talked to her about, you know, the whole dilemma, do we go back to Tasmania or don't we? And she did say Barbara needs his centres everywhere. And I, you know, I mean, and it's interesting because after I'd seen her in New York that time, that was it. There was that was finished, you know, done my business with her. And we went down and stayed with Sheila Krinsky for 3 months at Myrtle Beach, and David worked at Sherriar Press, and I had terrible headaches, sinus headaches because of the weather. But we did have, Kitty was really lovely to us because I was English and we'd been in England, and she sort of took us under her wing. And Marshall Hay had been in hospital in Charleston, been terribly ill, and Kitty was very fond of Marshall, and she was going to go down for the day to Charleston, and Lois Brager drove her, and they took us with them. And we went sightseeing while she went to the hospital. And on the way back, we stopped for a cray bake, or a clam bake. It was a clam bake. And so we had all these amazing clams. And she sat there and she told the story of Barbara's accident in America. I can't remember a word of it. But Lois Brager said afterwards, I've never heard her tell that story before. So I feel like she did it for Lois, not for us. And then, you know, at the end of the meal, she said to David, oh, could I have one of your cigarettes? And she lit up a cigarette and had that, so that was lovely. But, you know, Kitty had the most clear blue eyes I've ever seen in my life. It's like there was nothing, it was like clear and beautiful. Do you remember that? I don't know if that ever struck you, but I remember sitting on Mara's porch and holding her hand and just sitting next to her. Oh my God, just like no sanskaras is how it looked to me. I don't know if you can say that's what it was. Oh, the other thing is, of course, that in the 80s, Pat said to me that some blocks of land had been purchased and made available, and I should put our name down for one. And they were half-acre blocks, sort of on the backside of the tomb, and that Money wanted them to be developed with not all buildings everywhere, like in other parts, but big blocks of land with lots of trees and green growth. So I put our name down. And, you know, as time went on, we then had to pay for them. And then we were so lucky that later on we were able, when Lizzie left school, I'll tell you the story about what happened was that I didn't want her to go to schoolies because I think schoolies is a really destructive entry to adulthood. And I said to her, if I gave her a return ticket to India, would she not go to schoolies? And she said, can I swap that for a one-way ticket to London? And so she escaped schoolies, and she told me about what happened to the head girl during schoolies, and I think she was very glad she didn't go. And we were then free, and we could start our time of going to India. The first time we just went for 3 months, but then we started going for 6 months of the year, and we built a house there. And I mean, David was intimately involved with that because you have to supervise everything, because otherwise we would have had a 5-foot-high bathroom sink and things like that. But it's been so incredible being able to go there for the 6 months at a time. So just a little bit about Anna Vaz. She was the only one of the Mundley at Merazad who'd been married, and I think a lot of people talked to her about their relationships. Well, I never did. But I remember, you know, you sort of wonder why you're so lucky to be there. And she would say, you've done thousands of lifetimes of tap and jap, which is renunciation and meditation. And you know, when you look around the room and you go, really? We really have? Really, I have. But, you know, it's interesting. I mean, people do carry things with them at times where you go, I can see that, you know, people have these connections with meditation or fasting, or you just get a sense sometimes that there is something really long behind us, a long tradition. And it's kind of reassuring that, you know, we didn't just get here by accident. At Mehrabad, I mean, I remember when Rhoda and Jimmy were living there, and we, you know, he was such a card, wasn't he? Just a funny man, loved playing cards, and she was very soft and sweet. And of course, after he died, she went and lived at Merazad, and it was always really nice to see her. I didn't see her a lot, but, you know, I did go to Bindra House, which of course has since been pulled down. I do remember going with my mother and going to the loo and thinking, oh my God, this is the toilet that Baba peed in. I was a bit blown away by that. And you know, at the end, she was so fixated about taking Baba's name with her last breath. When she wasn't well, she'd be going, Baba, Baba, Baba. And they go, how are you, Guy mate? Baba, 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 Baba. And yes, but how are you, Baba, Baba, Baba? And I have got a story about when she died and Money was in the tomb, and Money, there's something about her being a white cow, I think there's some connection there. I'll have to look that up. So Erich, I don't know what it was about Erich. I think after he died, I felt like he was everybody's best friend, and you never felt like, although he did have people he hung out with more, but you never felt like you didn't get your share from him. And every time I left, I think, I'm going to be okay, I'm not going to cry, I'm not going to cry. And then I'd say goodbye to Erich, and I'd just lose it. And anyway, he was a bit chubby like me, and, you know, I'm not one to push to the front. And he and I remember there was a birthday cake, I think it was Molly Hayes' 21st, and she had this huge cake, and we were both standing back. And he goes, we shouldn't have any of this. And I go, I know, but of course we did. And I couldn't believe the way he was so nice to people. And I thought, you know, I remember when I met Delia, I thought, well, you know, I used to think that if you were a really good advanced soul, you'd be like Erich, but people just are who they are, aren't they? And I think he was just an exceptional human being. I remember this guy coming from Atlanta, and, you know, it's terrible. Like, we'd all been, did you see him this morning? He went up to Artie and he just had a thin skirt on with nothing underneath, and look at those nappy pins he's got in his ear and that sort of thing. Well, Erich met him. He goes and claps him on the shoulders. He said, how long have you been dressing like this? And I thought, what a great way to deal with it, instead of just talking about him behind his back, you know. It was really fascinating. And someone brought a girlfriend at one time who was a Buddhist, and Erich was so sweet. He took her around Mundley Hall, talked about all the things there, and he was just so incredibly patient. And even just before he died, I watched him one day. Someone came, and he was so concerned about looking after everybody. And in fact, I do remember the day where he got really cross with all of us. He said, you're going to have to take over. You're going to have to explain everything to people. You can't just sit there, you know. And I also remember the time that I know I'm not the only person that's felt unworthy, and I think it's a very common thing that you just feel like a worm, you know. You feel like you'll never be good enough. And he would say, you know, has anybody got a question? And I never used to have anything to ask, but this day I said, you know, look, I just feel so unworthy. And he said, it's just your ego. And it sort of went poof out the window. And so that's why I'm doing this now, you know. I also remember another day, Devana was looking for his chapels, and I was wearing them, but I had no idea. Why did I put his chapels on? Oh well. But I don't know what to say about Erich. He was just such a wonderful guy. And you know, the times that he took us to the caves, it just so incredible. And all day long, you know, he was almost tireless. So, and Meerwan, I know I haven't talked about everybody. I mean, when I first met Bao, he would be hearing Baba clicking his fingers because he was writing Lord Mayhair, and we all had to write our stories. And I really didn't do a good job, and I knew I didn't do a good job, and I said, look, just forget it, no, don't put mine in. And for all of his life, he'd say, should I forget? Should I forget? He wouldn't let me forget it. See, ego again. Meerwan, Erich's brother, boy, you know, I just feel so lucky that we were there in India a lot of the time towards the end, and we were able to go to Merazad, and we would sit with him and he'd say, they want you to go to the back. I said, what for? He said, well, you never go anymore. And I said, well, I want to just be with you. There were about maybe, you know, there'd be Huey and Jeannie, me, Sarah Pearson when she was around. They're just Paul Lieberon, you know, we'd just cluster around him as soon as he came out of his room. And his scoliosis was so bad and he was so bent, but you know, until he went into Mundley Hall, it was just really fantastic times. And I think as he came closer to his end, he had this need to tell us, take his name. And he told us some pretty grim stories, but he wanted to tell us how serious it was. He talked about Balak Bhagwan, who's the young man who just was addicted to people bowing down to him, and Baba made him promise not to do it anymore. And even at Baba's birthday in 1958, some of the people from his village came and he went out and they bowed down to him. And I looked him up online, and this awful Facebook page came up of him as an old man. And what Meerwan told us was that he would have millions of years extra because of all the sanskaras that he had accumulated from having people bow down to him. And when you look at him, you can see it was not a nice picture. It was very interesting. And so I felt that he was like, you know, he felt we were all too soft and he was trying to harden us up. And I remember someone from one of the American groups talking about asking him, how do you stop conflict within the groups? How do you all get on? And he told the story about Bidal's son who went to live with his brother. The story is that when Bidal was living, or she calls him Badal, so I guess that's how you pronounce his name. When Badal was living with Baba, he sent his son to his brother in Pune, and I think his brother must have had a factory. And it was obviously not a good relationship between his son and the brother. And one day the brother hit his son so hard he killed him. And Badal went to Baba and said, what should I do? And see, Franey thinks that her mother never knew this happened. She never heard anything about it in the family. And Baba said to Badal, go and bow down at his feet and apologise for imposing on him by having to look after your son. And Badal did it. That's what he did. He went and bowed at his brother's feet and apologised, and his brother started weeping and weeping. And so there was a sort of a resolution. And so really what Meerwan was saying was that, you know, you can always apologise, even And something our Prime Minister could learn, couldn't he? Even if, you know, you don't actually have to take whole responsibility, you can still apologise. And he was saying that's one of the best ways to have harmony in a group. But I loved Meerwan. He was just so lovely. I just read in one of the books that he called me a horse one day when I went in. I said, what do you mean I'm a horse? He said, you're a strong Australian horse like Francis. And I still don't really know. I'd forgotten all about it, actually. I didn't know that. It's just, it's difficult because I think it's such an incredible story, and he did tell it in Manderley Hall. And I told Franny about it, and she'd never heard, and she said, I don't believe it. And so she went and talked to him about it, and he told her the story. But, you know, I mean, it's difficult when it's somebody else's family that, I mean, I guess it's public. So, coming up to the 31st of August 2001. So on the 30th, my notes say, I cleaned the bottom left half of the marble. That was my first job. And it was a Merazad day, and Erich was at the trust office. This is the day before he died. Or he died that night, I guess. Meru told the story of Nadia dressing up in the 50s to entertain Baba. Examples included being a wrestler, Shivaji, Gandhi, Churchill. One time she dressed up as Churchill and got a cigar from Donkin and lit it and was puffing away. Baba asked, what are you doing, smoking? Playing the part, she was. Meru reckoned she enjoyed the cigar. And there was something going on with the Cumley coat at this time too, which I think is really interesting because the Cumley coat was so important. And what was happening was that Janet and Jess and Meredith had made a new box for it, and they were rehousing it. So, you know, the Cumley coat's the coat that Barbara wore and patched and kept wearing. And Jean Adriel, Mera had always looked after it, and Jean Adriel asked Mera if she could take it back to America, and Barbara said the coat was never to leave India. So the 31st, 2:30 in the morning, Erich joined Barbara. And there are funny stories about the dogs that he'd had contact with howling and, you know, anyway. And I remember I've got a note that Isaac Clay had never seen a dead body before, and he said he touched Erich's toe and it was really stiff. So Erich was brought to the Samadhi about 9:45 to 10 o'clock in the morning. And I remember he looked really small. You know, when they burn the bodies, they they have the face still open and they're just wrapped, really. And he was on the stretcher. And so then he was brought out onto the stage, and everybody had an opportunity to go and bow down to him and put a rose, or there was lots of roses there. And then they brought him down to Manderley Hall. And Meerwan was sitting there, and there were just tears running down the side of his face. Just not sobbing or anything, just quiet. I said to Meerwan, lucky Erich, unlucky you, and he said, lucky Gusi for being here. I remember Amrit helped carry the stretcher out. She was the only woman. Aluba, Bal and Meerwan were there. The women will come later. Meru, Katie and Goher came. Goher bent over. And moving with great difficulty, Manu and Rhoda had both had heart attacks. So in the morning, I was a bit late for the first time up to Artie. It was about 6:45. And I was walking up the hill with Arsenio, and I remember he had those shiny sort of trousers that sort of like noises go up. So I'm walking up talking to him, and at the top of the hill is Ward with his guitar and motorbike, and he stops and he says, have you heard, have you heard? So that's when we were told that Erich had died. And then Arsenio told me about a time years ago when he was in Manderley Hall with a handful of 2 or 3 pilgrims and money. And Money told the story of the ambulance borrowed from the Salvation Army to carry Baba on the stretcher to the Samadhi. The ambulance died after that day, and Money said that they also died while they were seemingly in motion. So on the Thursday, Erich said, "I'm Barbara's Erich and I must go and see Bao." And on leaving, he insisted that the calendar be turned to September. Kitty joked with him, but what if he died tomorrow? They'd have no date to write in. But he was most insistent. Who will do it? So Steve changed the calendar. Ramdas, the servant at Merazad. You know, Erich was on terribly restricted diet at the end, and you know, he wasn't allowed this and he wasn't allowed that, and he really liked certain food, and he'd sent Ramdas to get him some food that he wasn't allowed. Bhaja. Yes, because tomorrow I'll be gone, he said. So Ramdas was the only one who was weeping over Erich. Oh, that's right, they didn't burn Erich, they buried him, that's right. So he was in the coffin, an open coffin, carried out of Muntally Hall on the Rahuri cabin side and then round to the burial site. There was a huge crush of people. Devana, Gary and Alan stood on one side while people threw in handfuls of dirt and flowers, and they finished piling the dirt on just before Arti. Amrit had saved some flowers to put on top, red roses and marigolds. And Artie was very full. But you know, that night there were only 13 people booked into the Pilgrim Centre. And then shortly after that, of course, we had 9/11. So we were there for that as well. And that was a surreal experience. I mean, no TV, no radio, you know, just at the Pilgrim Centre. And I remember we went out to Amrit and Dara's house, and I saw it on TV and I thought, where's Bruce Willis? Because I felt like the Americans had made this film of this happening and Bruce Willis would walk out through the dust. But it was a pretty weird, intense time. So, you know, there are compensations to having a baby you don't want to have. One is the person themselves and what they become. And the other is getting this wonderful card from Money which says, "Dearest Gusi," and underneath is printed, "What you up to?" And she's drawn this beautiful little question mark, and it just says, "Now we know." And I have to say, you see, the thing is that the Mandali were never involved in any of my pregnancies except that one, because I had all the babies in the other three in the time that I wasn't going. But anyway, so she writes, "Now we know!" exclamation mark. And here's a special welcome. J. Barber to darling baby Elizabeth, the latest little love gift from beloved Barber to his Bowling and Carpenter family. A little heart. From all your Merazad family, our love to Mama and Papa and each of the dear family, including Granny Margaret. Avatar Maya Baba Ki Jai, Money, Ahmednagar, 14th of the 3rd, 88. So my mother was very much loved by the Mandali. And it's interesting, I found her terribly difficult, but they thought she was wonderful. So that was a good lesson for me, wasn't it? So my time in India, my relationship with India is one that I arrive at the airport and I can't wipe this stupid grin off my face. You know, there's this awful smell, loads of people, hot, sweaty, you know, but I can't stop smiling. And when we built our house, we've got this veranda that faces, you can't see the tomb, there's so many trees, but it faces towards the Samadhi. And I've had so many times when I've just sat there kind of lost, and I just feel like it's such sacred ground around there, that it's such a blessing to be there. I feel so many, you know, Arangown's got a history of Ram visiting there, and I just feel so many of the saints and the ancient ones have passed that way, and you feel like the dust still holds that impression. That's how I feel about it, and I love being at Merazad. I mean, you know, I don't go out to Merazad much at all now, because now the Mandali aren't there. It's not the same for me, you know. But at Merazad, there's this wonderful rhythm, you know. You've got the Dooni every month, and you've got Arti, and I used to go to Arti most days. There's something about saying the prayers together, like Barbara explained, that when we say the prayers together, he's with us, and you really feel it. And it's a wonderful kind of rhythm. And then So the first year that we went for a shortish time, Pat had me looking at photographs because they were going to republish Lord Mayhair, and I was going through the photographs. And the next year, Meredith asked me would I like to go and work on the photos in the archives, and I started, and I mean, it's just, you know, I've been a teacher and a social worker. Why am I doing this work? It doesn't really make much sense. But it's been an incredibly fabulous experience. You know, it's been incredibly difficult and frustrating, and I work a lot with the cooks, and we all say, if only we could start again with what we know now. You know, I just feel like I made such a mess of it to start with because I didn't know what I was doing. And when I think about the first photos I scanned, well, that was a bit of a botched job, but you know, we just move on and hope it all gets better, and thank God for Jim Frasino who can fix up some of the photos. But, you know, having done that, I then came and found photos here and thought, well, it's ridiculous not to do the same thing and use the same program to look after them. And when I started, there were just photos in a filing cabinet, weren't there? There was a yellow sampler box of Whitman's chocolates. Then all the men monthly had their boxes that they put things in that were the yellow Whitman's sampler boxes, and so did Francis. And see, the thing at the time is I've scanned photos that I've never been able to find again, and you know, people have thought they've been helpful tidying up, and probably the box was a bit messed up and it got thrown out. But you know, somehow it's managed to come together a lot, and there are all sorts of collections, and we're still finding things that I didn't know we had, and so that's pretty amazing. Yeah, and being able to, you see, at the end of Meherwan's time, to be able to go to Meherazade every week, it was like we just set that morning apart, and it would be a really long day and absolutely exhausting, and often it was like David's baking day when he had to get back, the next day, and he had to get back to light the fire, and we had to do shopping on the way, and he'd get home and be totally exhausted. But, you know, I just feel like it was such a wonderful opportunity to be around those people and it be part of our daily lives. Now, Guy Mai's death. So what happened was she had a series of small strokes. Then the final one, as Meherwan was reading to her, she never regained consciousness. She died the day the women went to the tomb, and breathed her last as Money was garlanding the tomb, and on the J, as Meherwan said, Avatar Meher Baba Ki Jai. Money looked up at Baba's picture in the tomb and saw a white cow in place of Baba. Looked away and looked back again, and again saw a beautiful face of a white cow. She later connected that Baba would call Guy Mai cow mother. And of course Guy Mai is supposed to be Baba's mother in the next Advent. And the other thing I didn't talk about was, you know, I'm not someone to push forward, and so when the women would come to do the flowers at Meherabad, I would often stand back, and I'd end up going, and she'd call me into the tin cabin, and she'd always give me this one particular rose, which in Australia is called Double Delight, but she called it the Kiss of Fire, and she'd always give me the same one, and gave me that to put in front of Baba's picture. No, this is Mera gave it to me. That's my story, as far as I can remember. Well, she was the last of the women Monthly, and lots of new people were coming, and you know, when you go onto the porch at Meherazade, there's Mera's chair with her photo on it. And she was just, I think people didn't know who she was. But to me, she was so significant. But you see, she'd always kind of been in the background. Her role and Money's role were to look after Mera, and they did that diligently. And I know when she came to stay with us, she was still heartbroken that Mera wasn't there. And she gave me the last photo that was taken of Mera, which was at Baba House in Pune. But it was a great loss to her, you know. Mera was really outside Baba, the main person, so she was not a front person, which is why I was not very kind when I teased her. She'd be the only one left. No, no, don't say that. Oh, I think she did, yes. You're absolutely right. She was sitting on the left side of the door, you know, as you went in, and she didn't she didn't want a big thing to be made of her. Well, that's why we went to try, and Sheila and I would go and tell jokes, and we weren't the only ones, you know, but just to try and make it all easier. And I remember Katie Pye saying, oh, there's not much point going, and I said, well, there is, because you can make it easier for them. So at the end of the day, we would, because we came by ST bus, we'd have to walk along the road lined by banyan trees from Merazad property out to where the bus came. And that first day, I just remember Francis was on one side on the left and Bao on the right, or maybe the other way around, but I think it was that way. Anyway, it doesn't even matter. And I just had that light bulb moment where it was so obvious that Baba was God, and it was almost like I'd always known it. In fact, I had a friend who once read the discourses, and she said to me, it's like what you've always known but you've never thought about. But I couldn't believe that I hadn't worked it out before. And it was such a relief, just such a relief to know that this is probably what I was looking for when I was a teenager. I had to wait a long time. Well, 10 or so years, but that's all I can really say about it, because it was so simple and so easy when it happened,